This is the Stein Seedcast. I'm your host, David Thompson. Join me as we visit with growers, agronomists, seed experts, and other industry professionals about seed, agronomy, and the business of farming. Today, our guest on the Seedcast is Stephanie Porter. She's an outreach agronomist for the Illinois Soybean Association. Thanks for joining us today, Stephanie.
Hi, glad to be here.
So Stephanie has more than 2 decades of experience in area of agronomy and conservation, to plant diagnostics, horticulture, and education. She is a certified crop advisor, and she's a key member of the Illinois Soybean Association's field research team. Today, Stephanie's joining us remotely from Taylorville, Illinois, to discuss red crown rot in soybeans. So let's get started. Well, Stephanie, for starters, thanks for joining us. As I always like to do, maybe to start things out, give us a little bit of background. Tell us about yourself and, again, some of your background and what you do there at the Illinois Soybean Association.
Sure. So I currently reside in, as you said, Taylorville, Illinois. Grew up on a farm near here still help my family farm in Nokomis, Illinois. I've been with the Illinois Soybean Association for the past 2 years. Previously, most recently worked for various seed companies and mostly agronomy roles. I was a soybean product manager most recently, worked in marketing as well. And before that, worked for U of I Extension, as well as both in the field as well as at the U of I Plant Clinic. So I do have a background from the University of Illinois in plant pathology. So diseases are something that I like, but also really have a strong passion for soybeans.
That's awesome. Well, you got a lot of history there serving the growers there in the state of Illinois, and so that's exciting. And that's kind of why I'd reached out to you. I want to talk today about a specific disease that I'm at least been hearing more and more about, and I was curious to kind of talk with you about, and that's red crown rot. So, I understand it's not new. It's been around for some time, but certainly to me, it seems like we're hearing about it more and more, and we're particularly hearing about it more in parts of the country that maybe we hadn't heard about it much lately. So I guess to get us started, what exactly is red crown rot?
Yeah, so it's nothing new. One of the papers, if you want to really dive hardcore into it, was a paper I was suggested to read. It was an LSU historical dissertation and thesis, but don't be scared by that, called Distribution and Management in Soybean Resistance, basically to at the time, the causal pathogen of red crown rot. And so in that, I'll just give you a basic rundown. It was first detected on peanuts. It was a different scientific name in 1966 in Georgia, and they called it black root rot. But later in 1972, it was found that this disease attacked soybean as well, and that's when they started to call it red crown rot. And it was known by some other names like Clacunum, black rot, and things that I cannot pronounce. Black root rot, basically a lot of colors of the rot, like now red. But basically, I think that a lot of the oftentimes overlooked fact is that this pathogen can infect a lot of different crops. So we think of it now as a major issue on soybean, but it also was an issue on peanut, papaya, koi, blueberries, and indigo. And the reason I say indigo is because they had a theory at one time that is how it spread to crop plantations through floodwaters and other, human activity that they did in the U.S. And that's how red crown rot spread to 17 soybean producing parishes in Louisiana. And so basically it wasn't discovered in Illinois until 2017, 2018. It was at that time reported by Dr. Nathan Klacheski, who was the U of I plant pathologist in Illinois, and it was found in Pike County. So that's, if you're not familiar with Illinois, that's in Western Illinois. So since then, it's been found throughout the state. I counted around 30 counties throughout, I would say, the midsection of the state, but also, of course, some areas in the south. And since then, it's been found in other states like Kentucky, and most recently in Indiana and Missouri.
And am I correct, Stephanie? It's basically a fungal disease?
That is correct. It's a fungal root rot
Okay.
pathogen that's affecting the root of the soybean.
So, given that fact, are there specific symptomologies that growers who are looking for this would find? And are they similar to what we see with other types of fungal rots, or how maybe are they different?
So it is very, very similar to a disease we're all too familiar with. One of the first diseases that we had on our farm, Sundust syndrome. So its foliar symptoms, I should say, are very similar to SDS, as well as brown stem rot and also stem canker. And when I say that, that means that it has those interveinal necrosis or kind of like yellow blotches in between the leaf veins. And so with red crown rot, that's why it's really important that we look at the base of the plant and we dig up the plant to try to identify it. It won't start to show up. Of course, it infects early. We can talk about that early in the season. And I think there needs to be more work done, and I think they're working on that now to identify the early season root rot phase. But most oftentimes it's seen at R3 or R4. And that's when, oftentimes R3 is when the spray rig's out. And that is sometimes whenever we got some reports of it because they started, when they went across to spray their fungicide at R3, they started to see some issues. The other problem is they just automatically assumed it was SDS because it's so common. And so then when you really start to get out there, you look at the base of the plant, and oftentimes it's red. And if you have enough moisture, or if it's a little bit later in the season, sometimes in mid-July or mid-August, you may not see this, but there are these tiny little ball-like fungal structures, and they're called perithecia. And that's what really sets it apart and helps to diagnose it from all the other diseases. The problem is, especially we've had some drought in the last couple years or other times, you may not see those. And so that's why it's very important to make sure you have the right disease and you identify it correctly. The problem also is as you get later and later into the season, like as into August and September, that plant, I know in the last year, it can really go down fast. It really deteriorates quickly, withers. And so it's really hard to diagnose this too, because that red crown rot becomes black rot. And then what happens is it produces, the fungus produces these microsclerotia, which basically are these survival structures that helps it and unfortunately keeps it in your field. And that's how it's spread. We don't know for sure how it's spread throughout Illinois, but we know it can be spread by wind, water, that's for sure. Water is for sure. Birds and equipment. And so these are, other ways other diseases can be spread as well. And so the other thing that I want to make a point of that I've really noticed, and other plant pathologists noticed too, that once it's infected with red crown rot, you can start to find a lot of other diseases as well, like stem canker, and it'll also be infected with SDS. So you might pull it up if you have moisture in the soil, you'll see that blue fungus, which is characteristic of SDS too. So that kind of hinders diagnosis as well, especially as you get in later into the season.
Yeah. So it sounds like I was going to ask you about, sounds like symptomology wise, it's similar to some other things. And now you've got the additive issue, it sounds like, where you may likely have multiple things happening at the same time.
Yeah, and I think that the symptoms will appear differently depending on the seasons. And so, for example, this year, I unfortunately found red crown rot in my neighbor's field. So it was about a mile away from our farm. And so they had red crown rot, and we also had SDS showing up a little bit on our April planted beans. So, to me, it's a little bit it showed up later, so that's good. We always have had SDS on our farm. It tells me that's a pretty high yielding field. But the symptomology compared to the red crown rot plants were basically dying much quicker. So that was another difference. Even though both of those diseases were showing up at the same time, the plants that had red crown rot were basically just going down fast.
Along those lines, I guess, what sort of environmental conditions are going to favor having the most prevalence of red crown rot showing up in soybeans?
Yeah. So one of the main differences is we've always been afraid, and we love to plant early here in Illinois.
Yep.
One of the ways that we deterred SDS was planting later. Well, unfortunately, this fungus throughout the season, red crown rot, favors a warmer, wet soil compared to something like an SDS that likes cooler and wet conditions. So think like 77 to 86 Fahrenheit. It also thrives just like a lot of other root rots, so it's not like it's anything different, in very poorly drained soils, so things that are compacted or have high clay content. And anything where it just thrives, where you might have heavy rains and water just becomes saturated in that field. And one of the main things is, and this is what happens to make these different diseases have the above ground symptoms like they do, is you in mid-season you get this heavy rain, and then that causes a toxin to go up throughout the plant and causes an interveinal necrosis between the leaf veins. So in order to get those foliar symptoms on something like brown stem rot and other pathogens, fungal diseases like SDS, brown stem rot, you have to have rain. Other things that promote it is continuous planting of susceptible crops. So, of course, bean on bean would make it much worse. In the instance, I've had Western Illinois farmers, it hasn't been totally confirmed, but they believe alfalfa is also can be a host of it as well. And in the instance of my neighbor, they are dairy farmers, and they had been growing alfalfa as well. So I think that's a watch out for growers in the crop rotation if you do get, have red crown rot. And the other thing, and I think it has been established in the literature, is the presence of SCN, or soybean cyst nematode, can make the disease worse. But we're also funding some research on that as well this year. But that can be an entry point to make pathogens like red crown rot and others like SDS and brown stem rot worse.
So, given that, what are you seeing in terms of the overall impact on the soybean crop itself? In an instance where you have infection occurs,
Yeah.
What kind of incidents are we looking at?
This pathogen primarily affects the roots and the lower stem. So very similar to a lot of these other diseases that we can see and know and we're familiar with. But it causes the premature aging of the plant. So basically, it's going to cause the plant to have a much earlier maturity than a healthier plant. And it will also stunt, cause the leaves to yellow, just overall have a lack of vigor. And because of all these symptoms, you eventually get fewer pods, fewer seeds per pods. It will reduce seed development and overall affect harvest by having a lower seed weight. And so that's when you can get some pretty good yield losses from this disease.
Are there, I wonder, like environmentally, with a lot of these issues we're talking about, whether it's SDS or SCN, we see certain parts of the field. There are what I call telltale signs in the way, that SCN gets moved mechanically, whatever, IDC, iron deficiency kind of shows itself in certain parts of a field. Do you see similar sort of pockets like that when it comes to this infection, or is it somewhat different?
I would say yes. In my experience, when finding the disease, when we first find it, I've found it in entryways, which could be either from it entering the field on tires, for example. I've also it could be because that's where the compaction is in the field. Other fields that I've visited that are fairly well established. It's across the entire field. There's no pattern. It's been spread by equipment across the field, obviously. The stranger thing about this disease that some of the farmers in Western Illinois have noticed is that it could be infecting one field and be perfectly fine in a nearby field. So there's some strange abnormalities to this disease that I don't think that we fully understand yet. And so it's hard to pinpoint, but I do think that I guess the spread would depend on the dispersal mechanism of how the disease was spread in the field.
Okay. So am I correct that there currently is no real genetic means of resistance? Is that fair to say?
When they did research on this disease in the South, which are, totally different along, cultivars than what we use nowadays and that type of thing, they did find differences in the genetic materials that they worked with. Recently, we do have some of the USDA working, it's Dr. Steve Clough, as well as Dr. Boris Camilletti, doing some current studies in Illinois where they've been working on, for example, seed treatments. Dr. Clough and his USDA have been working on different cultivars and looking at them in the greenhouse. And up until this point, they do suspect that there could be varietal differences. But this has not been confirmed yet by, scientific means. And so we're working towards that and trying to do different projects. The other interesting fact is that Dr. Boris Camilletti has just been funded by the United Soybean Board to do a project to evaluate different varieties that have rapid versus maybe a slower emergence rating, and see how they do against red crown rot as well. So those are some of the things that they're taking a look at.
So the theory there being that how that emerges may help mitigate some of the risk there.
Yeah. Another thing that I'm trying to help Dr. Boris Camilletti get started in doing another project is, to reach out to seed companies to see if they'd be interested in testing varieties against red crown rot in actual field setting. And this would be in coordination with our U of I variety testing program, which ISA also funds. So just a lot of different things going on, a lot of things to talk about.
Yeah. So in terms of thinking about, okay, if we don't know if we have true resistance yet or something like that, I guess, what are the management practices that you guys are talking to growers about? What can they do, if they have this concern or that maybe they've experienced it, so they're trying to figure out how do they mitigate their risk? What kind of management practices do you employ there?
Well, I want to preface this, which we are still learning, and the management practices that we have currently are not helping to totally deter this disease. It might help a bit. So there are some seed treatments that have been used that are getting labeled for red crown rot. You can help with your field drainage, which I'm a big advocate of for all diseases. Of course, crop rotation does help. But it's, again, not going, if you go to corn and then go to soybeans the next year, you're still going to have red crown rot. Weed control is another one, just because of some weeds, trees, we don't know for sure, could be potential hosts for this disease. Others maybe, early planting, which we don't have a problem doing here in Illinois, and maybe not planting into overly saturated soils. So again, that's just your agronomist telling you to make sure you plant into fit conditions. That can help as well. And continue and monitor and make sure you're diagnosing it correctly. And, some of these farmers that are just noticing it, they have it for the first time. And I've actually, walked fields and we find it in every one of their fields, but we may not. If they just find it in one field, they may want to harvest that field last. Or if they want to go to the extent of cleaning off their equipment too, we recommend that.
So earlier on, you had mentioned something that kind of I thought about, which was you talked about the long-term issue of this disease. And I think you said sclerotia, which reminded me of kind of like white mold, I think is a similar kind of mechanism. And I know that's particularly difficult like you said, once you have it, right? And
Right.
you're not hardly going to be able to just do away with it. So now you're left with how do you manage it or kind of treat those acres. So this sounds similar in that regard. So talking about, you've talked about some of the things that, as you said, this is an emerging area, but we talked about what you kind of are advising growers at least to be aware of and to be thinking of as they're maybe having concern with red crown rot. You touched on a couple of things, but maybe what are some of the things that you know of in the sphere that have been worked on or are being worked on with respect to research initiatives around red crown rot in soybeans?
Yeah, so we at the last Farm Progress Show had a Western Illinois farmer approach the Illinois Soybean Association and, really bring our attention to it. After that, we visited his fields in Western Illinois and Pike County. The agronomy team did. And since then, I've really made it my mission to help to get to this and get some funding. And so we have a long list of things that we're trying that Illinois Soybean Association is funding. So in 24, luckily, we just got a new plant pathologist at U of I, and his name's Dr. Boris Camilletti. He came here from UC Davis, and he's very eager to start studying this disease and help. And so he's been doing different models to study the disease distribution. So trying to do satellite imagery. He's also been doing experiments in plots. In the olden days, we had to use, inoculate plots. Nowadays, it's just all over. So we don't have to worry about that anymore, unfortunately. I got the idea from Dr. Sean Castile, who I went to U of I with, who's at Purdue. He made a comment about in his sulfur trials, when he was putting sulfur in soybeans, he thought there might be less SDS in some of these. So we reached out to them, got similar protocols, and we're going to see, what does sulfur have an impact on these diseases. Also working on other seed treatment evaluation trials all over the state, as well as farm trials, and also, of course, working on things in the greenhouse growth chamber and in vitro, and doing things that, totally out of my understanding, which is just everything we can think of. And in 2025, we're also, Illinois Soybean Association is going to be funding projects that explore, red crown rot effects with soybean cyst nematode. Also, what does in-furrow fungicide treatments do to red crown rot, as well as timing, and continue the satellite imagery project, as well as explore biocontrol options. So we're trying to throw just about everything at it, as well as hopefully, if we can get some seed companies interested, we want to do some trials with actual varieties if possible, if we're able to get that project up and going and funded.
And so sounds like you're being super vigilant there in your home state of Illinois, and that's great. You mentioned United Soybean Board. I don't know if you have other organizations like the NCSRP or anybody else that's working this on a larger scale, because obviously it sounds like this is a problem that's growing in importance across much of the soybean growing area. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. So I did comment on one project that was being funded. The other organization that we have been working very closely with is Dr. Steve Clough with USDA ARS. And so he had gotten my name 2 years ago and reached out to me and said he needed help. And so we've been working closely ever since then. And he basically is offering free testing for red crown rot in the state of Illinois. And I've had other people reach out, but definitely if you're not in Illinois, you can reach out to your own, diagnostic lab for help. Because I definitely think that this is a newer disease and you may not be able to do an in-field diagnosis. So Dr. Steve Clough has helped us. We organized a way for people to email him, get free shipping and a diagnosis, not just by visually or by a microscope, but also by a specialized PCR test to for sure diagnose this disease and know where it is and if you have it on your farm.
So it sounds like probably most of the more common testing facilities probably have the ability to evaluate for red crown rot.
Yes, that is for sure. And that's actually, I mean, I know for sure that's how they found it. Of course, by word of mouth, it's usually an agronomist or someone farmer that finds it first, but they send it off, for example, in Missouri. That's how they found it first in Missouri, by making sure they send it off to their diagnostic lab.
Well, so, we've talked about, again, that this is really just kind of, moving at the speed of light here with a lot of new things and a lot of additional understanding we're going to gain. I guess, any thoughts on how you see this evolving over the next few years, and what role do you think it's going to take in the overall complex? There's certainly no shortage of things for growers to be concerned about in terms of field pests and diseases. So where do you think this is going to shake out in the overall scheme of things?
Well, this is a major disease. It's much worse than I've ever seen anything else. Maybe white mold would be the other disease that I've seen do as much devastation as this disease, if I could try to, put up an analogy to another disease. But this can cause, up to 75% yield loss in a field. And so we are extremely concerned, especially being the Illinois Soybean Association, because some of these fields that farmers have had it for quite a while, and especially in counties like Pike and Madison that we hear about all the time, they're going to corn on corn. And so we don't want that. And so we're really trying to work towards a way that we can accurately identify it. So one of the problems right now that I'm hearing from agronomists is that the farmer goes out there, he sees a dip on the yield monitor, and he's like, I got red crown rot, which is not necessarily, true. We have a lot of other diseases out there, or a lot of other management issues going on. So I would say, first and foremost, to make sure that you actually have the disease. We still have other diseases out there. So that's another problem. I think we're also getting to the point where Illinois has a high number of absentee landowners. And researchers like Dr. Steve Clough are going out, traveling Illinois, finding the disease from the road, and then I'm helping him track down maybe whoever's farming it, or perhaps the agronomist that's helping take care of that land. And I'm fearing that the other issue is that once you have it, the farmer or the landowner may not want everybody else to know about it. So they may just kind of let it go. And so that's the other thing I fear. And I'm afraid that's how it's spreading as well, is just because of the lack of care. And I think that it has just really taken off and spread quite significantly in the last couple of years.
Well, and as I think we've said on this podcast many times, there's no shortage of things to look for in danger. We don't go looking for trouble, but somehow it's there. And it sounds like this one is certainly one that needs to be front and center on growers' radars, even if it's not something that they maybe are as familiar with from their past. So as we're wrapping up here today, I was going to ask you, so if anybody listening to our podcast wants to learn more, wants to get a better understanding of red crown rot, wants to learn about some of the work that you and your team have done, or again, just learn about red crown rot in general, what are resources you'd recommend for them?
Yeah, so everything that we've talked about today is on our fieldadvisor.com platform in various ways and methods, whether it be blogs, podcasts, webinars, and such. And for example, all the research that I listed off, for example, that Dr. Camilletti that's going to be working on, we're going to have a webinar coming up in the next several months, just so he can get updates out there. And so we really focus on outreach at fieldadvisor.com, and also share the same information on our Field Advisor social platforms. And you can also follow me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at SK Porter.
So Stephanie, thank you so much for coming on and joining us today to talk about red crown rot and the things you've learned and advice for growers as they're considering their cropping plans for 2025. We appreciate everything you and the Soybean Association do for growers in Illinois and around the country. Again, thanks for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Stein Seedcast. To never miss an episode, subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice. Have a question for our experts? email asktheseedcast@steinseed.com to have your questions answered on a future episode. To learn more about Stein Seed Company, visit steinseed.com. And remember, Stein has yield.